Good morning. For this one, you might need some espresso. Whether you just picked up your very first MPC or you've had one for a while like I did and it was sitting in the corner and every day you stare at it and go, what the f did I just buy? This is going to be a video manual going over everything regarding using the standalone versions of the MPC. Let's start by going over the overall concept of the MPC workflow, diving into each individual page. On this video, we're going to start off with going over the main screen, which is the one you're going to be working on and the one you can kind of stay on most of the time. And in future videos, we're going to go into all the nitty-gritty individual submenus that come on all the other pages. So without further ado, let's just dive right in. Now, one thing to note about the MPC workflow is that it's different than your traditional DAW like Ableton or Logic. Those DAWs work on a one-to-one workflow, meaning that for each instrument you insert, it's going to have its own dedicated track. That's considered one-to-one. MPCs work similar to, let's say, Studio One, where instruments and tracks are separated, and you can have multiple tracks triggering a single instrument. Now, when we head over to MPC land, we are going to have three key terms to consider: sequences, tracks, and programs. Just like any other DAW, inside of the MPC, a track is a container for either MIDI or audio information. Now, if it is MIDI information, it's going to be triggering one of 6 different kinds of programs. These programs will be represented by the following symbols: a drum program, plugin program, key group program, clip program, MIDI program, and a CV program. And just to recap, since it is not a one-to-one ratio, multiple tracks can trigger a single program, such as if you had a drum program and you wanted an individual track for each one of the drum sounds, a kick, a snare, a hi-hat, you would then have multiple tracks triggering that single program. Then we can go on and add effects to the overall project, and all of that information, the sequence of the MIDI notes, the audio and the audio tracks, those are all contained inside of a sequence. Now that we've covered the key concepts of the workflow of the MPC and the 3 key ingredients, sequences, tracks, and programs, let's take a look at this main screen, see where everything is laid out, all the submenus, so you can get going and start creating right away. Here we are on the MPC main page. Now this is the same page across all the current MPCs. And with any MPC screen, if you want to adjust a value, you can simply touch on it and use the rotary knob, or you can double tap. And that will pull up the submenu on the side. And then to get out of the submenu, just click in the gray area and you'll return back to the main screen. So starting on the left, we have what number is this track, and it's going to start off by saying unused. I would recommend naming the track as well as the program, and to do any renaming on either the track, the program, or the sequence, you just simply hit the A right here, and that will bring you into the name edit. So let's just call this drums. Now moving over to the right, we have the 6 different program types that this track can be triggering. We have the drums, plugins, key group, clip, MIDI, and CV. Now note that when you change the type of program this track is going to be triggering, the lower section will change to match. So right now we're in drum and it says a drum program right here. If we change this to a plugin, we're going to see that it switches to a plugin. If we change this to key group, it changes to a key group, so on and so forth. Now moving over to the right, we have the length of this track. By default, it matches the length of the sequence. Now let's say you had a long evolving 8-bar sequence, but you only wanted the drums to be a repeating 1-bar idea. You could have this length right here as 4 beats, and it would just be a 1-bar loop that repeats inside of the full length of the sequence. Now moving right below that, we have the velocity. Now the velocity essentially is what is the velocity of all of the elements contained within this track. Such as if you have a track with multiple velocities, you can decrease the overall velocity of all the events within that track by adjusting this velocity down to 50%. It will move the velocity of every event in that track down 50%, but they'll keep their relative velocity differences between the tracks. Then moving up, we have transpose. Now transpose just allows us to change all the events within this track by semitone, either up or down. The red circle is the record arm button, which automatically defaults to auto. Now what auto means is that you will hear the playback of the recorded notes and can trigger notes only when the track is record enabled. The next is merge. Merge means you will always hear the MIDI input and the recorded notes at the same time. Next is off, which means you will not hear any input, but you will hear the recorded notes. In is the opposite. You will always hear the input MIDI signals, but you won't hear any of the recorded notes. But with all these, sequence, track, or program, they all have their relative edit menu by clicking on the pencil in the lower corner. Below the track section, we have program. Here's where we will tell the track which program to trigger. Again, it will change based on the type of track above, but you will also have multiple programs within the same program type. An example of that is, let's say we're using 4 instances of hype. Let's say a bass, a pad, a pluck, and a lead. Each instance will have its own program under the plugin program section. This is where naming everything is highly recommended to keep things straight, and matching names to the track. Such as if we didn't name anything, what we'd see is plugin 1, plugin 2, plugin 3, plugin 4. But if we name it to match whatever the track is above, that's where it's able to keep things straight. So as an example, let's say this right here is our bass track, and I want this program to be my bass. Now these are going to correspondingly match, so I know that my bass is triggering my bass program. Now if I go to a new track, and let's say we'll call chords on this one, a lot of times people may forget to change out this and they go and change the preset. Well, what they just have done is change the sound of the bass on the bass track. So you always want to remember, when you add a track, you're going to hit this little plus button right here, and then you'll get a new program, and you want to name that program to correspond with the track that you're sequencing. So this again would be chords. So let's start off by going over what is all involved with a drum program, and then we'll go through all 6 of these different styles of programs. So within a drum program, right here we have the name of the program, and if you've loaded programs from your browser, this is where you're going to find them. By double clicking, you're going to see every single program that you've actually loaded into this project, and so you can freely change in between different programs. So moving over from the name, we have warp sample, assign samples, and edit samples. Now warp samples is the most comprehensive of the 3 menus, which we're going to cover every page of this in greater detail in a later video. But right from this page, you can see that you have a lot of control over the sample, including how many layers are inside of this one pad. You can layer up to 4 samples inside of a single pad. You can edit the start and the end of the sample just simply by dragging your finger or clicking within the box and using the rotary knob. You can change the key in semitones or fine tuning, and you're going to see the key shift respectively right here in the key. You can reverse the sample. You can turn on time stretching and warping. You can adjust how much of the time stretch do you want applied, and you can also adjust the original BPM and then BPM sync. Sometimes when you import a loop, it may not read it correctly and the original BPM may be off, so that's where it helps to actually touch on this and just adjust the BPM so it matches. But then we can go through the other pages and do even more sound design. We have envelopes, we have LFOs, we have modulation, and then here is the effects. Within each pad, you can layer up to 4 effects within the pad. Now, warp samples is where I spend most of my time when I am editing my samples, but let's go back to the main screen and check out edit samples. Now, edit samples has some similar things such as the tune, which is essentially changing the semitone up and down. Now, the only time I'm really inside of this edit samples is when I'm working with the loops and I'm chopping up a sample. That's where we'd hit trim right here at the bottom, and we'd switch trim into chop, and this is where we can chop up a sample, lay it across the pads, save it as a new program. Honestly, that is the only time that I am really inside of the edit samples. Assign samples is essentially the same as going into the browser. It's the assignment page, which is down here, but the main browser is just tapping over here to go to the main browse window. So in the assign page, you are seeing the entire pool of all the samples that can be then loaded into the individual pads. You will also see multiple names in the pads which have multiple samples inside of the layers. You can load up to 4 samples into a single pad, and this allows you to do something really cool called sample cycling. See the video link right here at the top of the screen to go into detail about what sample cycling is. You can also access this pool from warp samples by clicking on the layer and then the sample box right here. Double click on that and that will bring up the entire sample pool that you can then load into that specific layer. And now this one pad has 3 different sounds layered onto it. Now let's go into the plugin program, and as you can see, it's very similar on the left to the drum programs. It's going to start off with plugin 01, the tube synth, and the default. So this is where we would want to name our program to match the track name. Double tapping on plugin is where we're going to see the full menu of available plugins, and if you scroll down, this is where you're going to see all the drum plugins, such as the individual drum plugins or the multi, which is going to load all the drum modules across the lower 8 pads. Now, once we have selected what plugin we're going to have on there, let's say the hype, select that. Right below that is the preset. Now, double clicking on the preset will bring up actually the different categories that we can choose from. So as you can see, we have all these different categories, and then clicking into one, it will then take us to all the different presets that fall within that category. Select it, and as you can see, it will reflect right here at the bottom of the screen right there. Now, after you pick the instrument and the preset, we move over to the right and we see Pad Performer. Now, Pad Performer will allow you to change how the pads behave. This makes production a lot smoother because you can always play in key, you can find chords that work, and there's even progressions. You can change the root note, you can also change the octave, and it just makes production much smoother because you know everything you're playing is going to be in the key of the song. Now, moving over to key group, we see the same pattern where we just have a generic program with 00. So remember, if you have things loaded in to key group, you double tap, you're going to see a list of all the different key groups that you have loaded into this project that you can select from, or you can just create your own, and the familiar Pad Performer, which is the exact same if you're in the plugins. Moving down to the clip, again, we have clip 01, and then we can go in and edit the clip. Editing the clip is essentially a very basic version of edit samples. It's just editing different loops. Then we go into MIDI. Same thing, we want to always make sure to rename our MIDI program so we don't end up messing up when we're adding in more tracks. What channel is it going out of what MIDI port? So if we double click on here, we'd just say, okay, MPC A, and I want it going on channel 3. Then we have bank MSB and bank LSB. Those are a bit more complex to go into detail on this video, so that's something you would want to Google to understand how MSB and LSB work. Most of the time you aren't going to have to worry about that. And then the familiar Pad Performer. Then let's go over to CV. CV is similar to MIDI, where it's going to be sending a signal from the MPC to an external unit, just using control voltage instead of MIDI signals. And it's what ports is it coming out of? Is the mod wheel active? Is the velocity active? So regardless of which program type you are on, again, in the lower right, we have the pencil that's going to show us the menu of everything we can do within this program. And we're going to go over all this in detail in a later video, but get in here, look around, have a peek so you're familiar with all the terms with inside this menu. And moving to the top center, we have sequences, and a sequence contains all the information of the tracks and the programs. A sequence can be treated as different sections of a song, and that's how I use my sequences. So I'll have sequence 1 as the intro, sequence 2 as the verse, and sequence 3 as the chorus. Or a sequence can actually be an entirely new song idea, because switching in between sequences, you can have a track named completely different, assigned to a completely different program in the previous sequence, and so forth. I like to keep my sequences as sections of a song and keep the project as an entire song, but you could have one project with multiple song ideas inside of that. Now on the left is where we're going to be naming our sequence, which of course we can change with the little text button right here. The BPM is the tempo of the song, then the length of the sequence. One little note though is that if you want to, let's say, change this length of the sequence from 2 to 4 or to 8, and you don't want to reprogram anything, I'd suggest going in to the menu and using double length. That will double the length of the sequence and copy over all the events in all of the tracks, so you don't have to go back and reprogram things. To the right of that, we have the start and end point of the sequence, and then also if this sequence is going to loop or not. This is handy, let's say, if you're programming the outro and you just want it to play one time and then stop playback on the unit itself. You would turn off the looping. Once this sequence plays one time through, it will stop and the music will stop and everything of the sort. So handy little trick right there. And then transpose will actually transpose every single thing inside of this project. So if you have a singer that wants to try the song in a different key, you can simply go in and transpose the entire song up or down and then see if it works inside of their register. And of course, the lower right is the full edit menu pertaining to what you can do with the sequence. My most common thing that I do use in here is going to be double the length of the sequence, and then also copy the sequence. Let's say if I had an intro sequence, I wanted to copy it to the second sequence and then add some more things to make it into a verse, I would use copy sequence right there. Now let's jump over to the left side, and starting at the top, we have the home icon. That just brings us back to this main page that we're looking at right now. So if we're in any of them, we hit the home, we're going to go back to the main. You can also get there by hitting the main hardware button. Moving down from that is going to be our grid edit. This is where we're going to be sequencing out our MIDI notes by drawing them in. We can highlight some, we can delete them. If you hold down the shift button on the hardware, you are going to see a submenu pull up below on the bottom section of the screen. Now moving below that, we go into our track overview. This is going to show us a summary of all the MIDI tracks and the audio tracks with some basic information. What is their monitor setting? What is their volume? What is the input and the output? What program is running with inside of that track? This is a good way just to have an overlook view of what you're actually working with inside of the project. Below that, we have the step sequencer. The step sequencer essentially allows you to take a sound. You can hit pad select and then tap one of the 16 pads, or it will default to the last pad that you touched, and then simply draw in different events and then adjust the velocity accordingly. That's going to be your step sequencing window. And then below that is your XY effect. You would have to insert an XY, and if you want to change it, you hit setup right here in the lower corner. You can go through a whole bunch of different really cool XY effects, and those are really fun to play with by dragging your finger across the screen and hearing how it affects the audio, defaulting to the main output. Now let's take a look at the top. First is the name of the project. Remember, a project holds everything, all the sequences, which hold all the track and program information. The folder will show you everything contained within the project, the programs that are being used, all the samples within the project, and also all the sequences that you're going to be working with in the according sequence name. So if you were using this for intro, verse, and chorus, you would see the names corresponding right here, intro, verse, and chorus. Moving over from that, the I and the O is going to show all your open MIDI connections. So if you have a lot of external gear, this is where you're going to get a great overview of everything that's connected to the MPC. Moving over from the I/O is going to be the bars, beats, and ticks. Now this I think is often overlooked because this is really valuable to actually scroll through the project like a jog wheel on a console or a controller. So if you have, let's say, a 16 bar sequence and you're here in the edit mode and you want to scrub, instead of tapping up here on this overview to move the playhead around, the easiest way to do that is just to touch on bars, beats, and clicks, and now essentially the rotary knob becomes a jog wheel, allowing you to scrub through the project. This is really handy for copying and pasting and just jumping to the exact place you want to paste the MIDI notes. Then moving over from that is going to be your time correction. By default, it is on. One cool thing to try on an MPC is just to quantize the first note of, let's say, a 4-bar idea, and then finger drum in the remainder of the notes. That's a little trick Timberland always uses, and you'll notice with his beats, they're never quite perfect, but they have a specific feel and groove to them. That is one thing to try on the MPC, is take off the time correction and let your natural rhythm sequence for you. And then you can always go in and nudge the notes forward and backwards to get it a little tighter, but don't be too reliant on the time correction. So moving over from the time correction, we have the metronome, and we can just tap on that to go into the metronome. We can adjust how it behaves, if there's a count in, if it happens during recording or record play or only during play, what the rate of the metronome is, the sound of the metronome, the level of the metronome, and then next to that is going to be our automation, turning it from read to write. You'll see an R and a W. This is handy if you're using plugins and you want to record some filter automation or record some parameter changes. Quickly just turn it onto the W, playback, twist the knob. It doesn't have to be recording. You can just be playing, twisting the knob, and then make sure to turn it back to read so you don't accidentally adjust some parameters that you don't want to have automation on. One thing to note with all these, time correction, metronome, and the automation, if you hold down Shift, you're going to see a highlight come over them. I'm hitting Shift on the physical controller. And this allows you to really easily turn on and off the time correction, turn on and off the metronome, and completely turn off all the automation. Then in the upper right, we have the system resources. That's going to tell me my battery, how much CPU am I using, how much memory, and my different storage locations. The one on the left is going to be my internal memory, and this is my 1 terabyte drive inside. And then we're going to see Purge right here. Now Purge will actually allow you to delete any sort of unused samples before you save. That will save you memory space. So get in the habit before you save to purge unused samples, and that will keep your project size small and you won't have a bunch of unused samples saved into your storage space. Now after the upper right, we're going to want to go over and have a look right here. This is, I think, one of the most powerful parts of this screen. Typically, you're just going to see this as where the volume meter comes through. But if you click this little eyeball up top, we open a whole new hidden menu. And this menu contains ability to focus on the pad, which is the big square. The 4 little squares is the program. The 3 lines are the track. And then this is the master output. So going over to the left, I can see that I'm on pad A03. And the volume of that is coming out through the program itself. I don't have any effects on this. It's not solo or muted. It is the volume adjustment right here, and then I can change the panning of that individual sound. Then I can go to the bigger picture and I can move out to the program. So by clicking that guy right there, now I can adjust the overall volume of everything within this entire program, all the sounds. I can see that there's a compressor and a reverb on this program, and that I actually have this program soloed and the state of the automation of the entire unit. So if we go here and unsolo it, you're going to see that it's now unsoloed. And if I change the automation right here, we're going to see that the automation corresponds. So it's just another quick location to change the automation state. I can adjust the volume of the program. Again, this is everything contained inside of the program, all of the sounds, and I can pan the program right here. Then I can go out even further from the program into the actual track. Well, what is this track? Well, the track is the drums. It is using the program of Vintage Space Kit 2. It's receiving MIDI input from all the ports. It's sending the MIDI nowhere, and it's in the current state is set to in. So again, if we hide this, it's just another menu of how to do this if we are going through and adjusting more. Then on the far right, we have the master output. Now, as you can see, remember when we inserted the XY effect, we can see that it did insert on the master output right here. We can adjust the volume of the master output. We can change where the master output is going if we want to, let's say, route the master output to output 3 and 4 in the back of this unit. But this is an amazing hidden menu. Do not overlook this. Once you start using this, you're going to be using it all the time. When I'm producing, this menu is always open because it's much easier for me to, let's say, add a filter to a drum sound by having this open than going into the menu and then going into program edit and then going into this sound and then going over to effect and adding it right here. It's much easier from the main just to pop open the hidden menu right here, put it on pad focus, and then tap on this screen. Then I can add that effect on this individual pad instantly without leaving my main screen. And that's gonna wrap it up for your first edition of your MPC Masterclass. I hope that helped explain a little bit more about the workflow and that main screen that you're gonna find yourself on a lot to give you a solid foundation for how to use your MPC. Now, in future videos, we're gonna go over the browser, all the submenus, editing, making beats from start to finish, and everything else you need to know to really master your MPC. If you made it this far to the end of the video, I know it's a lot of information in there, so give yourself a pat on the back. And on that note, thanks for your time, thanks for your attention. Now, go make something cool.